All right. Well, welcome back to the Sundays Coming podcast. I'm super excited for today's conversation. As always, I'm here with Kaleb.
That's me.
Yep.
What's up?
And today, I'm so excited to be here with my friend Nick, who's going to share a little bit about his story and some really cool things that he's involved in serving churches and I assume other organizations beside churches as well.
Yeah, all kinds of places.
But I think we'll have a lot to learn and a lot of insight from what he's going to share. So, Nick, so glad you're here.
Likewise,
Yeah.
I am both nervous and excited about this conversation with you guys.
like every podcast we do, that's how we always start out, feeling a little nervous,
Yeah.
a little excited, but I'm sure it'll be awesome.
Yeah.
It'll be great.
So you started and are the co-founder of an organization called Bravingbird. I've heard a lot of amazing things about you guys because you started. When did it officially launch or become a thing?
No, that's really funny because I think we've actually been in existence for something like 3.5 years.
Yes.
But publicly, no one's known about us until about 1.5 years ago.
Yeah.
Is when we had like our big launch party.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's so great.
Give us like a 2-sentence spiel.
Okay.
Like, if I know nothing about you or Bravingbird, what do you guys do?
We tell stories to help the curious explore the deep and hidden things of God. So we believe in the power of storytelling and the ways that they can help us encounter and unlock the things that have been hidden since the beginning of time, I guess.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And what was the moment where you're like, hey, I think I could do this thing where I make stories and tell stories and make videos and people watch them and we could actually do this thing as a job, as a real organization?
Man, moment in time. I mean, behind every moment, there's like,
I think one key data point to tell the audience is that you give them away for free.
I
think I probably should have led with that. Is you give them away for free. So now you can tell us again about how does it all work?
Yes, we give them away for free. Anyone can download and use our stuff to their heart's content, no strings attached. And that's because a lot like you guys, we are committed to resourcing the church and helping churches. We know what it's like when most of us that are on staff at Bravingbird have been in full-time roles in the church previous. And so we know that Sunday's coming. We know what that grind can feel like. We know how sometimes you just need a leg up or you need a weekend off or you just need a little help. And sometimes it's even just knowing that there's someone out there for you. So those are the kinds of people that we want to be able to resource. But you asked like, what was the moment that started to tell us that maybe this could be a thing? And behind every moment are months and years and just so many decisions stacked up, But Bravingbird started with me and my best friend in my backyard, sitting around a fire one night going, what are we going to do next with our lives? And we had both been in long-term, full-time roles at churches and had both stepped out of those seasons really feeling called by God to do something new, but we didn't know what that new was. And we also didn't know it was going to be together. And so we sort of started this independent processing and trying to determine what might be next and started to dream up this thing. Because for a long time, man, I guess I kind of got to go all the way back.
Oh, I mean, please. Do. That's why we're here, Nick.
I'm going to go all the way back.
Go.
Okay, so growing up, I was that weird creative kid. I was always writing. I was putting on shows for my family. I loved theater. I loved storytelling. I read books like crazy. And I relished anything that was creative, whether I was good at it or not. I loved doing it. And it was the summer between junior high and high school. It's that classic story, went to summer camp and first started feeling this call in ministry. I grew up in church. It that was so much of my family's life was really centered around church. And when I first started to think that God was calling me into some kind of full-time ministry, when we're young, we see things in black and white. And for me, what I thought that meant was a very standard trajectory of what it looked like to be a pastor in a church.
Yeah.
I imagined someday I was going to be a youth pastor. And then after that, I was going to maybe be like a lead pastor or an executive pastor or something like that. That was just the trajectory that I saw for my life. And I had always sort of assumed that all of these things, all these creative things that I loved doing were things that I was supposed to set aside to do this thing that God had asked me to do. And I graduated from high school, started my first semester in college, and I was a Christian ministries major. Okay. And I was sitting in some of my first theology classes. And after class, all the other kids in the class wanted to go to the coffee shop to debate theology. And I'm sitting there just going, these are not my people. I love God, but these conversations are just not the things that I care about. And granted, it might have been a weird school, a weird group.
We won't ask you which school it was.
Exactly.
You don't have to say, it's fine.
Shall not be named.
That's right.
But I panicked because also at the time I was terrified of public speaking. And I'm like, okay, so I don't really want to have these conversations, nor do I want to get up in front of people and preach. So why am I on this path exactly? And because where I spent all my time was in the theater building and the music building and the art building. Those were my people. That's where I loved spending my time. And so I gave up on the Christian ministries major. And again, the way we just see things in black and white, I think when I made that decision, I think I also thought I was giving up on God. Because that call had been so clear in my life. And I felt like I wasn't able to live up to that call. And so by walking away from it and walking toward the creative things I love to do, I thought I was turning my back on God in a lot of ways. But for the next several years, I moved around the country a little bit. I pursued theater and directing and all these kinds of things and saw very marginal success and a whole lot of failure and rejection. And the rejection was okay, but coupled with the grind that is that life. And the desire to someday have a family, I saw that was incompatible. And then also where I was at spiritually was just such a dark place because I felt this incredible distance from God. Until after college, I became the technical director for a theater in North Carolina. And when that place went bankrupt and I found out I'd lost my job, it was like the last straw for me. And I ended up on the floor of my bedroom, just weeping and going, God, what do you want from me? And so clearly in my heart, I felt him say, I called you to the church. I didn't call you not to be you. And it was the first time that I started to see how the church, a role in the church and my creativity could actually play together and how maybe even necessary that was. And so I made one of those bargains with God. It's like, okay, well, if you can find me a creative job in a church, like, do those exist? Because at the time it wasn't that much of a thing. I mean, I don't know. I won't say how old I am, but this was a few decades ago. And there wasn't a lot like that out there. But lo and behold, 6 months later, I was the video guy at a church in San Diego. And it's so funny because I was listening to your conversation with Dennis from a few weeks ago, who just started his days at a church called Skyline, and that was my first job.
No
Really?
way.
That was my first job in a church.
Oh,
I
that's
was
fascinating.
the video guy
Wow.
at Skyline Church in San Diego.
No kidding.
And it was an interesting journey there, though, because again, I came on as the video guy, and then I don't know if it's because we were just really short-staffed, but they let me try my hand at almost anything. And so I kind of got to try out what it was like to be a different kind of pastor too.
Yeah.
Like they put me in charge of young adults. For some reason, they put me in charge of all of adult discipleship. I mean, I'm like this like mid-20s kid, basically, that's suddenly supposed to be like leading hearts and minds, right?
It's amazing.
Don't trust me with that. And occasionally I would teach and all of these different kinds of things that I thought I was going to do in ministry. And it was actually confirmation for me in so many ways of like, these things are good. And in certain seasons, they might be things that I can and should do, but the thing I love to do is tell stories.
Yeah.
And so I started looking for a place where I could do that full time. I became the creative director at a church in Orange County, and I was there for 6 or 7 years. And then I got a call from Willow Creek and said no, and God started a really different journey. And lo and behold, a few months later, my family and I moved to the Chicago area, and we were at Willow for 6 or 7 years. I was the creative director there. And then when that season ended, that's when me and my friend found ourselves around that campfire in my backyard going, what do we do now?
Yeah.
Dude, that's awesome. I can't believe you work at Skyline. That's so funny.
How full
That
circle
is
crazy
so-
is that?
Were you weren't there because John Maxwell was like early on.
Right.
there,
I was after
right?
John Maxwell.
Okay.
Yeah, I was under, the lead pastor at the time was Jim Garlow.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. That's so funny. Yeah. Last time I was there, this is a total side note. I was like upstairs by their like amp racks, and there's this very old photo of John Maxwell. It's almost like a painting type thing. And I'm like
his official portrait.
I'm like, that's weird. And I had no context of like he was
Totally.
originally there back in, I don't know.
if we look in just the right closet, will we find your official portrait somewhere in Skyline, Nick?
I think I sat for many portraits,
Right.
so I'm sure they're
They're
on a lot of
collectible,
walls.
I would say.
Yeah,
That's funny.
Yeah. No, when I was there, the building wasn't there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like the
Yeah.
auditorium that they have
Yeah.
now wasn't.
It's a
even
beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful,
Yeah.
like, I mean, yeah, San Diego's an
That
incredible
was-
place.
And when I was there, that was just an open field, and we would do these huge outdoor services. Like
Wow.
for Christmas every year,
Okay.
we would do this pageant outdoors up on the
Yep.
field, and we'd set up giant bleachers, and there's camels. And, I mean, just
amazing.
the full,
Amazing.
Wow.
yeah. the
And you
full
moved to
thing.
Chicago where
I was gonna
Christmas
say,
is
yeah,
a little
not
different.
It's a little different. Yeah, it was a bit of a shock to the system. But my wife and I, we grew up in Ohio, so we
Okay.
knew what we were coming
Okay.
back to. A
Okay.
little bit.
So yeah.
I'm curious when you started out in that first role at Skyline,
Yeah.
video guy. I don't know what they gave you as a title back then.
I don't remember. It might have been something pretty
Yeah.
close to video guy.
Well, I'm curious, sort of, as you were going into that first role, kind of what you pictured storytelling in the church to look like, and what you show up thinking, I'm going to do X, Y, Z. Like, what did that look like versus what you experienced to actually be, and kind of, I don't know, your growth in formulating and solidifying your understanding of kind of how do the stories that we tell serve the church, and what are the needs that are being met. And that answer might bridge beyond Skyline, but sort of how has that developed in your mind? Obviously it leads you to where you're at today. And maybe what were some of the missteps or misconceptions that you've sort of worked through over the years?
Yeah, when I first started, all anyone really meant by video guy was make video announcements.
Right.
I actually came on right as the church, oh my gosh, maybe it was turning 50.
Okay.
And so I was making this giant retrospective
Did you have to
video.
watch hundreds of hours of sermon
Hundreds
footage?
of hours. The
Like
great
claw
thing
clips?
about it was like the best orientation ever.
Sure.
Because walking in totally blind and having to go through all of the archives and all of the
Yeah.
history, I felt like I had this opportunity to absorb the culture in this really unique
Yeah.
way. But yeah, I mean, I was making retrospective videos, and I was making announcement videos, and I was making like stupid, just funny Father's Day videos. You know,
Yeah.
just I wouldn't call what I was doing storytelling.
Yeah.
And I remember one of the first videos that I made that felt like a story was we did an update of one of the stories where Jesus heals a blind man. And yeah, we just kind of created this modern version of it. And in trying to script that story and film it and even talk actors through what we were trying to accomplish, that story from scripture came alive to me in a totally different way. All of these narratives that I had grown up with my entire life. I mean, it's so obvious, but suddenly I was like, these are about real people.
Yeah.
Like, these things actually occurred. And in every one of them, Jesus is communicating something about who he is in that story. And it was really eye-opening to me. And so then we started picking different stories from the Bible, and some of them are narrative and some of them were the parables, and I was starting to come alive to how powerful those things were in a church setting, because again, you have so many people who have grown up with scripture their whole life, but sometimes they need to see it through a different lens. And it was coming alive for them in a different way too. And that was like the first glimpse for me of how powerful stories could be. But it started me on this long journey of recognizing, I don't know exactly when it happened. I don't think it was, I think it was sometime during my tenure at the next church. But I feel like this is truly a grace of God. But he started helping me to see the world differently. I've always been captivated by John chapter 1 when it describes, it takes the creation story and turns it into poetry. And it describes the person of Jesus as the Word. And again, you think all the way back to Genesis and this idea of God creating everything out of a word. And I just had this image that formed in my mind of, if God created everything with the Word, and if Jesus is the Word, then that Word has to be written in all of creation. If we could only learn to read it. And so I started to look at the world differently and believe that if I asked a question as simple as, God, how could I see you in this? That it would unlock this whole world underneath the world. Every rock, every tree, every conversation, every circumstance. If I could start to say, Jesus, where are you in this? It would unlock metaphors and stories and all, so that now sometimes I'll even challenge myself, like, look at this tree. What does that tell me about who Jesus is? And suddenly this story starts to blossom about the way that roots reach into the ground. It, like, just Jesus is everywhere. Everything is a metaphor that points back to him. And I became very passionate about finding those metaphors and helping to unlock what I was seeing for other people too, through storytelling.
Did you have experiences where, like, you're seeing these metaphors and these opportunities and these stories kind of in your mind, and like, how are those received? Like, are they, what is the pushback, or I don't know, what kind of reception are those finding in your different church contexts?
Yeah, it's so funny. I was protected for a long time because I mean, again, I was creative director at a church. And so I was at churches that were pro-creativity, that were pro-story. And it allowed me to develop a mindset and a passion that didn't probably meet a ton of resistance, so that maybe even so that I could advocate, so that I could continue to learn, that those early discoveries weren't shut down. Because now I talk to so many pastors and church leaders, and I don't find resistance to the idea of how powerful stories can be. I just find they're unsure how to proceed.
Mm-hmm.
What would I believe stories are powerful. I love watching movies.
Yeah.
I love television shows, but how does that help me with the gospel?
Yeah,
How does that
that's
help
good.
me in the life of my church? And those are some of my most fun conversations.
Well, maybe say more about that, because that's one of the things I wanted to get into in this conversation is, what do you say to that ministry leader, that pastor who's exactly in that space? They're unsure of how to proceed. They've maybe never either seen it done in a context that they feel like, oh yeah, that could have application where I'm at. I don't feel like I have the resources, whatever that might be. What do those conversations sound like when you talk to them?
Yeah. So Joseph Campbell is an expert on stories. I mean, he literally kind of wrote the book on stories. And what he says is people forget facts, but they remember stories. And I think that's one of the best arguments we can make because I think we can tell people that Jesus loves them over and over and over and over again, and they can hear it, but their hearts forget it. But if we can tell it to them through a story, if they can feel the love of Jesus differently, that hits different. And so I think in those conversations with pastors, it's not about giving up your teaching time. It's not about trying to find a way to stick a video to keep everybody entertained. It's not just coming up with interesting anecdotes. It's saying, how can we get people to experience God differently? On that, we're on the same page.
Yeah.
We want to bring people to Jesus. And here's a tool in story that I think will help you engage them, body, mind, soul, emotion, all of it. And I think once you start to understand that, who would say no to that?
Yeah.
If I can engage people in the most holistic way possible, why would I set that aside?
Yeah.
Well, you've set the bar really low because you just give them away for free. So
Yeah, we did.
how can you say no?
And that's the other thing. And it's, I think even starting out, we knew that for a lot of churches, for a lot of church leaders, this is new.
Yeah.
They've never had the resources. They don't have creative teams. They can't pay anybody to do that. And the truth is, most of what we're finding online when we start our searches for like good sermon resources, most of it is
Terrible.
It's like good effort, good heart, but its actual execution is hard. And so I think that has been some of the root of resistance is I don't have the time, I don't have the money, and the stuff that's out there isn't any good.
Yeah.
And so we wanted to try to solve those problems because a third of the time that Jesus was opening his mouth, as we look at all of the red letters in scripture of Jesus speaking in the Gospels, a third of his words are used to tell stories.
Yeah.
And I feel like as the church, we are setting aside one of our most powerful tools when we choose not to do that.
Yeah. It's so interesting. I think that's such a new, like you said, it's such a new thing for churches. They weren't telling stories in that way through video or through, anything primarily other than somebody telling. Yeah. Oh, drama was a thing. That was,
drama.
I'm not kidding.
That was a thing.
That was
Man,
a big thing. I'm not joking. That was a serious business.
thing.
That was
Church drama.
That was the thing. I think of all of those things that I experienced through the 90s. And
Totally. I did a lot of that
Do you guys
church
ever do
drama.
human
you guys.
videos? You know what I'm talking about? Nick, you know what I'm talking about, right?
No.
You know what I'm talking
Yes,
about.
you
Okay.
explain.
Help me.
How do you explain it? I usually was to a song, but you would like act out the story of the song. This is something that youth groups would do as like
Okay.
a thing. And
Yeah.
trying to think
Always-
of
I mean,
it.
that's
always
like- involved
That's like
somebody, like,
verging on
pulling-
interpretive
yeah, right.
dance.
Yeah, it's exactly what it is. It's interpretive dance, 100%.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just by a different name.
Yes, right. Yes. It's not dancing,
Probably
Nick,
by
because we can't do
non-dancers.
that.
Right,
in
exactly.
church,
That just
but-
leads to all kinds of other things.
Yes.
But the resources out there, you're so right. Like I remember 10, 12 years ago looking back and going, into some creative meeting, like, hey, we got to go find this video that ties in with this thing that we're doing for the sermon series. And we all go hunting for 30 minutes.
Yep.
And they would present their ideas that they found on the internet for $30. I can pay for this horrible 2-minute video. And the worst one always got chosen. And then all of a sudden I'm sitting
the one you submit, like, no one will choose this, but I've done my homework.
I'm putting this one in so that they will choose the one that
choose
I want.
the right one.
Yes.
Backfire. Exactly.
Yeah.
Every time.
But that's all that was out there.
Yeah.
You know, so I love that idea, you know, of that. And I think even today, like so many people, just like you were saying, are ingrained in film and television and the way that stories are being told everywhere else that we are consuming that in our lives, whether it's, you know, through even radio and, you know, TV and film and now short stories and TikToks and Instagram reels. It's like, it doesn't matter. It's all story. So I love that perspective of that. Also, that's really fascinating that, you know, you're talking about the 1/3 of scripture and what Jesus is talking about is story. I just go, man, why wouldn't we follow that?
Exactly.
Like, why would we not just follow the thing that is laid out for us perfectly in scripture?
Yes. And even when the disciples ask him, like, what? Because I think it's Mark 4:34. Oh man, I'm not sure I'm going to get that right. But in Mark, it says he's telling stories all the time. Basically, every time he opens his mouth, he's telling a story. Yep. And the disciples ask him, like, what? Dude, what's with the stories all of the time? I think this is the NIV translation that I'm doing. And he said, and he quotes from the Psalms, and he says, I speak in parables to unlock the mysteries that have been hidden since the beginning of the world. And that tells me that stories hit different. Yep. Stories are doing something different than expository teaching. And there is place for all of it, but let's not set aside the power of story. I was, my wife and I, this was several weeks ago now, we had another family over for dinner, and the husband and wife in this family both happen to be therapists. And I realized this, like, it connected with me as I'm like opening up the door to welcome them in for dinner. And suddenly there's like, I feel very exposed, you know, like this could be a very dangerous dinner conversation. But it was lovely. But we were sitting there and we're both very interested in the work that each other does. And so they're asking me a lot about story, and I'm asking them a lot about their roles as therapists. And we get into this whole conversation about attachment theory and this idea of the way that we attach in relationships early in life translates often to all of our relationships. The coping mechanisms we learn, the ways that we learn to make ourselves more acceptable in the eyes of some of our most important relationships. We also bring those things to our relationship with God.
Yeah.
And they talked about when they are in the process of therapy with someone who is struggling with a particular area of attachment, that no amount of information in the world changes their thoughts or their behavior. They can know that something is true, but if they don't feel it, if they haven't experienced that truth differently and consistently, they can't actually change their behavior. They talked about their own relationship. They said, like, when we first got married, we had all kinds of attachment issues. And it was hard to believe that the other partner in our marriage loved us. And they could tell me that again and again and again. But until I saw them being faithful consistently over time, that's when I started to believe they loved me and I could let my guard down. And they helped me understand. They were saying that's one of the reasons stories are actually so important. Because when you tell a story, when that story is about God, when it engages them heart, mind, and soul, you are not just giving them new information, you are giving them a different experience of who God is and the way that he cares about them. Yeah. And in those experiences, they can begin to reorient their relationship to God. And I just, that's what I want to do.
Yeah.
I think that's what we all want to do. as leaders in the church, as people trying to resource the church. And in particular, my bent, my little slice of the pie, the way that I get to do that is through story.
How you going?
Oh, okay. Well, so many places we can go. I mean, I'm just curious with that in mind, as you think about that goal, what is the process you guys go through as you're determining what stories are we going to tell? Because you don't work at a church now, so you don't have to do one for Father's Day. You don't have to do one for Christmas.
Yep.
You can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
So there's like, how do you define the sandbox and kind of orient your efforts and kind of figure out what are the right stories for us to talk about or invest in right now?
Yeah, it's interesting because when we first started, we didn't know what was going to work. And so we threw a lot of darts at the wall, and some of them hit the target and some of them didn't. We're actually getting a little bit more strategic now in starting to think about series and starting to think about topics. But I still think at the very heart of it, the thing that compels us to tell the stories that we do are when they're capturing our own hearts first. They're the things that we're getting curious about, the things that God is teaching us. Those are the stories that we're bringing to the table. And then we sort of layer the strategic conversation of what's best right now in this season, what pairs best with other films we've released, all that kind of stuff. But again, it goes back to if you're not telling a story from an authentic place, it's hard for that to feel authentic to the people who eventually watch it. So a lot of times in my role as creative director at Bravingbird, my job is to bring several ideas to the table. And a lot of times I will write 3 drafts of 3 different pieces, and I will sit at the table with our team and read through these scripts in their earliest stages. And the question for all of us is, which one of these or which ones of these should we put into production? And one of the true tests is whichever one makes me cry.
That's amazing.
Because
I feel very confident, Nick, in your ability to have 3 stories that all make you cry.
Oh, that's right.
So how do you choose?
Yeah, it happens frequently. But it's true that if my heart is captured for it, it will at the end of the day be powerful. So then coupling that with the strategic conversation is, it's fun and interesting for us right now.
Do you see, as you talk to church leaders, I don't know, well, let me ask a setup question.
Okay.
Like, what is your interaction with the churches that use your content or are curious about it, or you're just in a relationship? Like, how do you connect with them? What are those conversations like?
I mean, so much of it is anecdotal right now. We're trying to, again, we're so new. It felt like when we started this thing, we had the first rock in our stepping stones across the river. And so it feels like every couple months we get another stone further out into the river, and we're wading out there slowly. And so we're still learning. So it has been very anecdotal thus far. A lot of it has been friends of friends saying, hey, we're using your video this weekend, and this is how we're using it, and this is what's working. And we're always asking follow-up questions of what's not working. Right. What do you wish had been different about that piece, or what else do you wish we would release? But we're starting to hit. We're starting to get enough people using our stuff in the last few months that I think that feedback mechanism is going to get a little better, where we can send out solicitation basically and say what's working, what's different, what do you wish we had in the library that we don't. So we're just starting to get that. But we have this piece called Orange Juice, and it's all about the goodness of God. And we just got an email and then a video from a pastor this last week sharing how he watched the video. He found himself in tears watching it online. He's like, I can't wait to share this with my congregation. And he's like, I didn't want to just stick it in a worship set and so they ended up wrapping their entire service around this film.
Wow.
And And it even led into a communion moment. It led into a reflection where they gave everybody little boxes, little juice boxes of orange juice, and gave them reflection questions. Like, as you're drinking this orange juice, be reflecting on the goodness of God.
That's awesome.
And he was sharing, he's like, young and old alike, he's like, I've received more positive feedback on that service than anything we've done in years. And again, I think he was incredibly creative in the way that he chose to use it, which is awesome. But it's also just the power of stories to mark moments and to engage people. Yeah, don't want to leave that on the table.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I watched the Season to Taste.
Yeah.
Which I thought was incredible. But I see, the way you're speaking about even your history and your past and like bringing that into the story and the authenticity that comes from your experience and you talking about where you were at in your life and weaving this into, the story of, cooking and all this stuff. It was amazing. And I love, seeing that and then being able to go, hey, if a church is able to take that and whether they're using it in the middle of a worship set or during the middle of a message or whatever it is to be able to tell that story effectively, it's got to be good for you to be able to hear some of that feedback in that way of the orange juice and in that story that you guys did.
It's so amazing because it is incredibly gratifying to hear, and I'm continually amazed how a personal story that means something to me can be so relatable for other people. I grew up Christian kid, grew up in the church. I sometimes say that I was saved before I needed saving. I didn't have one of those rebellion, hellion to saint kinds of stories. And so for the longest time in my life, I didn't think I had any stories to tell. And one of the really eye-opening moments for me, when I moved from California to Chicago, I had this fairly harrowing experience of losing my keys in the middle of a field in Nebraska. It's a long story.
Wow. It is very unique.
Yes. And I had written that story down and posted on a blog. Hey guys, remember blogs?
Was it your MySpace?
Yeah, exactly.
Tumblr.
And I remember I walked into, one of my first meetings with our programming team at Willow. And one of the worship leaders came up to me and she said, I just read that blog. And she said, you got to tell that story. And I was like, what? I did. I wrote it on the blog. She's like, no, that's a story for the church, because it was all about getting lost and trusting God that even when you feel at your most lost, he knows right where you are.
Yeah.
And is with you in that spot. And I'm almost embarrassed to admit that how much of a light bulb turned on in my head at that moment. Because again, I didn't think I had a story. And I realized in that moment that it's not just my testimony story that's worth telling.
Yeah.
It's all of the moments in between where God shows up, or all of the moments where it doesn't look like it has anything to do with God at all. But again, you scratch one layer deeper and you find him there. You find his character there.
Yeah.
You find his sovereignty there. And so I started learning how to tell my own stories, ordinary, everyday stories from my life that when you start to see God in there, they're not ordinary, everyday stories anymore.
Yeah. I think I love stand-up comedy.
Yeah.
And my favorite comedians are the ones that are just basically relating their life and they go, hey, I just come here to report back to whatever my family does. And I just tell the stories of whatever's happening. It's hilarious.
To their chagrin.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Because it's so true. It's relatable. It goes, oh my gosh, I also have a crazy kid.
And the only thing different about your experience and that comedian's experience is the lens and the order and the timing with which they tell the story.
Correct.
And they take the things that probably are very common experiences and they present them in a way that is different and fresh and
Yes.
in this case, funny.
And it totally makes sense because we're story people.
Yeah.
It's what we were built for. The whole way that we interpret the universe around us is through story. Like so my kids, I think, are home alone right now. And if I come home and find clothes all over the floor and food, like probably the refrigerator door will be open. And like instantly in my mind, I start to tell myself a story of how all of these things came to be. As human beings,
Yes.
story is in our nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so even if the details of my story are not the same as yours, you start to interpret it and apply it to your own. It's just, that's the way.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's why God gave us
Mhm.
story, because he said, this is actually the way I designed you to think and make sense of things.
Yeah. So when you think back to that light bulb moment, in that programming meeting, how and I'm thinking of the creative people, that are listening, myself included, that I'm just going, how did you go about taking some of those stories that you had that you thought were not important, that you were just like, meh, it's just a part of my life. I just lost my keys in Nebraska in a few.
As one does.
As one does, which by the way, I would love to hear that story at some point. How did you kind of take those things and start to apply them and go, how do I tell the story in a way that is actually meaningful? Because I think there's a lot of people that could listen to this and go, I've got some stuff that's happened to me, but just like you're saying, and how a comedian presents it and the timing and how it goes about the story to get to the end product, there's an art in that, that I could have the exact same story as this person, and I could tell it and it's not funny. It's
Exactly.
It's not interesting, and people don't
That's
care.
good.
And then somebody else rewrites it in that timing, and
If I had lost my keys in Nebraska, there would have been no story.
Yeah.
But you created a story out of it. How do you do that?
Oh man, I don't know where to start on that, because
I imagine it's a muscle you just have to intentionally start to practice.
It is. There's so much trial and error.
Yeah.
I've been doing this for years, and it's one of the reasons I think God even called me to the church is because it's where I learned to tell stories. So you were talking about church drama. I started the drama team in my youth group, right? And we would write some terrible script and perform it every week. We would basically rehearse for 30 minutes before everybody else showed up.
I love it.
Half memorize the lines and just put on something. It just
nowadays you could spend like $100 a week to go to an improv class and do the same thing.
That's it's so true. But my church, the church that I grew up in, let me try and fail over and over and over again. And it is those early reps, and then the reps in high school and college and every rep since then that has given me instincts. I don't think that they're naturally inborn, really. I think it's something you just have to start practicing, but be okay with failing. I'm lucky enough that a lot of my failures were early. And I mean, when I say that they were bad scripts, they were really, really bad. But that's the only way that you get better, is if you want to tell stories, you start telling them and you see what works, and you find all the stuff that doesn't and dump that and keep going.
Yeah.
So the best time to start is just now.
Yeah.
Start practicing that.
Right
Think
now.
about it.
Yeah.
What would you say, to somebody listening and they're going, there's no room for me to fail in my ministry environment, right?
Yeah.
Because I can just think, I think of hey, there is no failure option here. There is no trial and error, that we have this creative freedom. There's too many people that are watching every section of the video going, I don't like this, I don't like that, I don't like that, I don't like this part of the script, whatever. How do you go about
Never
that?
experienced that before,
No,
the over-the-shoulder
I have
editor.
never
You've never had that
experienced
happen.
a lot of chiefs or a lot of opinions. No, you got to fail earlier. You got to fail off stage. I have a couple people in my life who will tell me the absolute truth. Because I think I feel that same thing. Like when we release a film as Bravingbird right now, it doesn't feel like there's room for failure.
Yeah.
But that film has failed 50 times in the production of it. The first draft was a failure. The second draft was a failure. The first edit was like, find the one. It might just be one. But if you can find a couple, who are the people in your life who are going to tell you the truth? That you can rehearse that, the story you want to tell on Sunday, rehearse it on Friday and Saturday with your spouse or a coworker or anybody else who will listen and tell and ask for the truth. Like, what is boring? What is funny? What is not hitting? What's confusing? All of it. Fail early.
Yeah. And I think I love the emotion to it, right? And you said earlier, you're taking whatever your story is and I'm interpreting it in my own life and context of my own world. And I'm taking those pieces, and God designed our brains to do that incredibly. And I think back to doing that versus, I keep going back to comedy and funny things, but I think, so many churches and those, funny, stupid Father's Day videos or like all of the weird, cheesy, awful things. And we would always go like, why didn't that hit? And all I could think of is like, comedy in that way is so subjective.
Yeah.
I was with somebody yesterday. Like, I love The Office, right?
Yeah.
It's amazing. There's a lot of people who are like, that is the not funny at all. And I hate it in every way because it's so subjective. But when you think and take comedy out of it and you go, but emotion and feeling through story, through me explaining something and expressing, in that way, whether it's through video or just telling a story verbally, that hits with so many more people and has the ability to, like, your success rate of hitting emotions or feelings in that is so much higher than, some stuff like that. And I love that, but I'm sure it's hard as you continue to go through the creative process.
One of the things I think about all the time for artists is, and I think the same applies to pastors and pretty much anybody in any leadership position, is you have to go first. I remember every time we were planning a Christmas or something, we're thinking about it in June and July.
Yep.
Nobody's thinking about Christmas right now. But the artists have to go first. In June or July, they have to wrap their minds and hearts around the Christmas story and find a reason to care again, so that they care so much that they can lead an audience of people to care that much. I have a friend who, she does a lot of public speaking and a lot of church speaking. And early on in her career in doing that, she had like one or two messages in her back pocket that she would just deliver consistently. Like they were like surefire hits. And then she started finding the more bookings she had, she was being assigned passages. And this was a super new experience for her. And she said, what I realized I had to do is I just had to sit and read the passage and go, why do I care? Why do I care? Not just what can I teach? It wasn't just what can I teach that's interesting out of this, but why do I care? Because until I care, I can't expect anybody else to care. And I think the same is true in story. Like, if you're going to tell a story, you have to care about it.
Yeah.
You have to feel it. It has to mean something to you. And then it becomes worth telling, sometimes even without a lot of skill. If people can see, we have all been in testimony, story sharing kinds of environments where normal people who aren't used to being on a stage will stand up and tell a story, and it is a hot mess. And they do not deliver it well. And it has all kinds of rabbit trails, but you can see how central it is to who they are.
Yeah.
You care through them.
Yeah.
And so you can try to master storytelling, but I think the first thing you have to do is care.
I love that.
That's good, man. It's a good challenge for, I think, anyone listening, whatever seat they might be sitting in the ministry context, whether they're a communicator or a production person or a worship leader or whatever. Like, I think that challenge to remind yourself why you care, why are you doing the thing you're doing, is so critical.
Yeah, it's hard because I think in the same way that you're describing the speaker, go, hey, here's the passage that we want you to teach on. I think often in the creative space, there's this, hey, we're doing this thing. I need you to create this
That's right.
video
100%.
that tells the story.
Yeah.
And you're like,
Yeah.
why do I care? In every way.
Another Mother's Day video. Okay.
Another-
Why do I care?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Because that's how it works. I think even today, and the creative space has changed so much in church, there's still those creative directors they're not always super high up in the food chain still.
Yeah.
And they're still, they're given direction and they go, oh, I have to make something work with this. How in the world am I going to do that and try to captivate this thing that somebody else has, given me that, I'm trying to tell the story about. And so I just love that, I think the way you guys are going about doing that is really incredible. And like I said, at the beginning, I'm like, I heard about you guys for a long time leading up into, your guys' launch and just going, what are they doing? That's incredible. Like, how are they doing that? And so, I'm just super excited for, what that looks like as you guys continue to move, forward and try new things and reiterate through, before it ever hits your website of this is live, this is a thing we're doing, and so I love that.
Maybe say a little bit about how people can find Bravingbird, how they can connect, what they should expect to see if they Google you.
Yeah, so if you go to bravingbird.com or you Google Bravingbird, again, the words are Bravingbird, but it's all one word. You'll come to our website and you will find a variety of videos, a library that we are always adding to. And you can search those videos by scripture. You can search them by topic and theme. And then if you click on any one of those to watch them, there's also a drop down that gives you some of the key passages that might touch on or some of the key themes. And one of the things we're kind of working on building out a little bit are additional resources and things that can accompany those. But right now, the heartbeat of everything we do are those films that we share.
It's awesome. Well, I'm excited to continue a couple other sections in this conversation. For those of you listening right now, we're going to continue this conversation into part 2. So stay tuned for next week because
Nick's our first 2-part guest.
And
awesome.
man, we could probably do 3 or 4 parts at this point.
Right.
But we're excited for that. So thanks for kind of being here for this first part, and we'll see you guys.
My pleasure.
Next week.